Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're diving into something that's essential for any French learner who really wants to level up their skills. We're talking about French adverbs and figuring out just where they like to hang out in a sentence.
Right, you are. It can feel like a bit of a puzzle at first, but trust me, once you crack the code of adverb placement, it's like unlocking a whole new level of fluency and precision in French.
So, to help us solve this linguistic puzzle, I've brought in a true expert in French grammar. Welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to dive into the fascinating world of adverbs with you and all our listeners.
Especially since, if I'm being honest, adverbs have always been a bit of a head scratcher for me. I mean, sometimes they seem to pop up anywhere in a sentence. Where do we even begin with this deep dive? What's the game plan?
Well, a great place to start is by understanding the goals of our listeners today. They're looking to master adverbs so they can ace those tricky quizzes on the Pronunciator app and finally earn that adverb certificate.
The Pronunciator Adverb Certificate. The holy grail for any serious French learner. I've heard those quizzes can be pretty challenging.
They can be, for sure. That's why we're here to break down the mystery of adverb placement in a way that's clear, easy to understand, and most importantly, helps our listeners actually use this knowledge in their everyday French.
Okay, I'm ready to unlock the secrets of those adverbs. But before we get too deep into the pronunciator specifics, let's talk big picture for a second. Where do adverbs usually go in French sentences? I mean, is it anything like in English?
Well, in many ways it is. The most common placement for an adverb is right after the verb it's modifying, just like we often do in English. For example, you might say, je parle lentement, which means I speak slowly.
Okay, that makes sense. So lentement, which means slowly, comes right after the verb parler. But I have a feeling things are about to get a bit more complicated, right? Especially with all those different verb tenses. French has those compound tenses, like the passé composé always seem to trip me up.
Ah, yes, the compound tenses. They definitely add another layer of complexity. But don't worry, it's not as overwhelming as it might seem.
Okay, good. Because from what I've seen in the pronunciator library, those compound tenses really shake things up when it comes to adverb placement.
You're absolutely right. With simple tenses like the present or the imperfect, the adverb happily sits right after the conjugated verb. But with compound tenses, like the passé composé, the adverb often goes after the auxiliary verb instead. You know, the helping verb like avoir or être.
So, like in the sentence, j'ai bien compris, which means I have understood well. The adverb bien is coming after a, which is the auxiliary verb, right?
Bingo! It's almost as if the adverb is sandwiched between the two parts of the verb, the auxiliary and the past participle.
Ooh, I like that. The adverb sandwich. That's a good way to remember it.
Yep.
Speaking of sandwiches, I remember seeing something about a ne pas sandwich in the pronunciator library. What's that all about?
I'm guessing that's super important for negation, which I know is a big part of those quizzes. You're spot on. Negation is a key concept in French, and understanding the ne pas sandwich is essential. Just imagine your conjugated verb as the delicious filling in a sandwich, nestled right between ne and pas.
Okay, I'm starting to visualize this sandwich. So in a simple sentence like je ne parle pas français, I don't speak French, the verb parle is snuggled right between ne and pas.
Exactly. And this placement is crucial because it emphasizes the negation, making it much more prominent than in English. But hold on tight because things get a little more interesting when we bring those compound tenses back into the picture.
Oh boy, here we go again. So, does our no pas sandwich get even more complex with compound tenses?
Well, it does get a slight twist. Ne still hangs out before the auxiliary verb, just like before, but pas usually decides to move after the past participle instead.
Hold up, let me get this straight. So it's like ne is super loyal to the auxiliary verb, while pas is flitting off to dance with the past participle.
That's one way to put it. It's like a little grammatical choreography. So instead of j'ai pas compris, which would be incorrect, we say je n'ai pas compris, I haven't understood.
Wow, this is making those pronunciator quizzes feel a lot less intimidating already. But there's one thing I keep seeing pop up in the pronunciator library that I have to ask about. What about those adverbs of frequency? Words like toujours, souvent, or jamais. Where do those usually go? I feel like they're all over the place.
You're right to notice them. Adverbs of frequency are super common and important in French. And luckily, they tend to have a pretty consistent placement pattern.
Okay, good. Let's hear it. Spill the secrets.
In simple tenses, they typically go right before the conjugated verb. So if you want to say, I always eat breakfast, you would say, je mange toujours le petit déjeuner.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. But I bet there's a twist coming when we throw those compound tenses back into the mix, right?
You know it. With compound tenses, those adverbs of frequency like to cozy up between the auxiliary verb and the past participle. So, I have always eaten breakfast becomes j'ai toujours mangé le petit déjeuner.
Wait, so it's like they're following the pas from the ne pas sandwich.
Yeah.
They want to be after the auxiliary verb in compound tenses. I'm starting to see a pattern here. This is amazing.
That's exactly it. You're starting to crack the code. And trust me, once you grasp these basic principles, the rest will start to fall into place.
Okay, I'm feeling more and more confident with every adverb we tackle. This deep dive is already a game changer. But I do have one more burning question that keeps coming up in the pronunciator library. What about those adverbs that modify adjectives or even other adverbs? Where do those go? They seem like the rule breakers of the adverb world.
That's a great question, and luckily it's one of the simpler rules to remember. In those cases, the adverb goes right before the adjective or adverb it's modifying. So, très bien, for example, means very good, with très intensifying bien.
Okay, so it's like the adverb is giving the adjective a little boost, making it stronger or more specific. But I have to ask, what happens if we switch the order around? Does it change the meaning?
You're absolutely right to ask that. In French, word order is crucial, and even a small change can drastically alter the meaning. If we tried to say bien très, it would sound completely unnatural and confusing to a French speaker. It's like saying good very. In English, it just doesn't work.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's amazing how such a small detail can make such a big difference. This deep dive is making me want to revisit all those examples in the pronunciator library with fresh eyes.
That's the spirit. And we'll be dissecting plenty more examples as we go along. In fact, let's talk about those tricky short adverbs, bien and mal. They seem to have a mind of their own, especially when those compound tenses are involved.
Oh yes, those two. They've definitely caused me some confusion in the past. Do they still follow that handy-dandy sandwich rule we talked about earlier?
Not quite. These little rebels have a special quirk. Instead of hanging out after the auxiliary verb like we'd expect, they actually prefer to be placed after the past participle.
Wait, hold on. So it's not j'ai bien compris, but j'ai compris bien. That seems completely backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive at first, but that's the beauty of language. There are always little surprises waiting to be discovered. So yes, these short adverbs, bien and mal, have their own unique rule, and mastering it is definitely key for acing those pronunciator quizzes.
Okay, I'm making a mental note of that. Bien and mal, always after the past participle in compound tenses. Got it. This is already making me feel so much more confident about tackling those quizzes.
That's what we like to hear. Remember, the more you practice, the more these rules will become second nature to you. And before you know it, you'll be speaking French with more fluency and precision than you ever thought possible.
I can't wait. I'm so excited to keep exploring those pronunciator library modules and see what other adverb adventures await. I'm feeling like a true French grammar detective now.
That's the spirit. And the adventure doesn't stop here. We still have plenty more ground to cover. Stay tuned for even more insightful tips, surprising exceptions, and of course those all-important pronunciator quiz strategies in our next two parts. Welcome back, everyone. Ready for round 2 of our French adverb deep dive.
Absolutely. I'm feeling way more confident about adverbs after our last chat, but I know there's still so much more to learn, especially with all the different types of adverbs out there. Like I was checking out the pronunciator libraries section on adverbs of manner, words like rapidement or doucement. But those comparison exercises, oh boy, they really had me stumped.
Yeah, adverbs of manner in comparisons can be a little tricky at first. But here's the good news. They usually just hang out after the verb they're describing, similar to many other adverbs we've already talked about.
So if I want to say how someone is doing something, I just pop the adverb right after the verb. Like he walks slowly would be il marche lentement.
You got it. Lentement goes right after marche to tell us how he walks. It's all about painting a clear picture with your words.
Okay, I'm starting to get the hang of this. But what about those adverbs of time? They seem like they could go almost anywhere in the sentence. I mean, I've seen them at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. It's a bit overwhelming.
You're right. Adverbs of time do have a bit more flexibility. Think of them as those friends who can fit in anywhere at a party. They can hang out at the beginning, the end, or even slip into the middle of a conversation. But the key is their placement depends on what you want to emphasize.
So it's all about strategy and choosing the spot that best gets your meaning across.
Exactly. It's like you're directing a play. You want to position your actors, in this case adverbs, in a way that highlights their role and creates the right impact for the scene.
Oh, I love that. the adverb as a dramatic actor. That's a fun way to think about it. Okay, let's switch gears for a second and go back to the world of negation. We've mastered the ni.pas sandwich for simple sentences, but what about other negative adverbs? Like, I see ni.plus plus and ni.jamais popping up all the time in those pronunciator quizzes. Do they follow the same roles?
They do. Just like net pas, they love that sandwich structure. Ness always comes before the conjugated verb or the auxiliary verb in compound tenses, setting the stage for that no feeling. And the second part, whether it's pu, jamais, or another negative adverb, usually goes after the main verb if it's a simple tense.
So like, je ne mange jamais de viande. I never eat meat. Follows that pattern, right? Ne comes before mange and jamais comes after it.
Perfect example, you're getting it. But just remember, with those tricky compound tenses, the second part of the negation, like jamais, scoots over to a position after the past participle.
Ah, so je n'ai jamais mangé de viande. I have never eaten meat. Has jamais cozying up after the past participle manger. Okay, the pattern is starting to click. But wait, what happens when we throw those possessive pronouns into the mix? You know, those little guys like me, Ted, we, they always seem to want to be right next to the verb.
Those pronouns do love to be close to the action. They're like the VIPs of the sentence, always getting front row seats. So in simple tenses, the object pronoun comes before the verb and the adverb follows. Il me voit souvent. He sees me often would be a good example of that.
Got it. Pronoun first, claiming its spot right by the verb, and then the adverb follows along. But in compound tenses, does the adverb still come last?
It does, but with a slight twist. In compound tenses, the adverb actually goes between the auxiliary verb and the past participle. So, il m'a souvent vu, he has often seen me, follows that structure.
So it's like the adverb is trying to get as close as possible to the action without stepping on the toes of the pronoun.
I love that way of thinking about it. It's a little grammatical dance, isn't it? And mastering this dance is what those pronunciator quizzes are all about. It's about understanding how these different parts of a sentence interact and play off each other.
This is so cool. I'm starting to feel like I could see the patterns in French grammar, like I'm cracking a secret code or something.
Yeah.
Speaking of codes, there's one more thing that keeps popping up in the pronunciator library that I just have to ask about. What about those adverbs toujours and aussi when they're not with the verb, but modifying an adjective instead? Do they still follow the same rules?
Great question. They're actually a bit like chameleons, changing their behavior depending on who they're hanging out with. When they're with an adjective, they like to cozy up right before it. So instead of je suis content toujours, which sounds a bit off, we say je suis toujours content. I am always happy.
Interesting. It's like they want to emphasize their bond with the adjective becoming one unit of meaning. So many little details to remember. This makes me wonder, what about those more complex verb constructions like reflexive verbs or that faire plus infinitive structure?
Right.
Do those throw a wrench into our adverb placement strategies?
Don't worry, we've got you covered. With reflexive verbs, remember that the reflexive pronoun acts a lot like an object pronoun. So the placement rules we just talked about still apply. The adverb usually goes after the conjugated verb, even if the reflexive pronoun is there.
Okay, so the reflexive pronoun doesn't change the game for the adverb. It just adds a little extra flair.
Yeah.
Phew, that's a relief. What about faire plus infinitive? Those always make my head spin a bit.
Faire plus infinitive can be tricky, but the logic is still there. If the adverb is describing faire, it goes after faire. But if it's describing the infinitive, it goes after the infinitive. So you just have to figure who the adverb is really talking to.
Right, so it's like being a detective again, figuring out who's doing what in the sentence and where the adverb fits into the story. This whole deep dive is making me appreciate the complexities of French grammar in a whole new way.
That's fantastic to hear. We want you to not just memorize rules, but to really understand why they exist and how they work. And honestly, once you start seeing those patterns and connections, French grammar becomes much less intimidating and much more enjoyable.
I am totally with you on that. I'm actually starting to look forward to those pronunciator quizzes now. It's like
Yeah.
I have a secret weapon, a deeper understanding of how these adverbs work their magic.
That's the spirit. And the best part is, we're not done yet. We still have one more part of our deep dive to go. Stay tuned for even more adverb adventures and pronunciator quiz-crushing strategies.
Okay, I'm ready for the final round of our adverb adventure. I feel like I've leveled up my French grammar skills big time after tackling parts 1 and 2 and exploring those pronunciator library modules.
I'm loving your enthusiasm. You've definitely come a long way in understanding how adverbs work in French. But we've got a few more tricks to share, especially when it comes to those multi-talented adverbial pronouns we and un.
Oh yeah, those two. I've definitely bumped into them in the pronunciator library, but they've always been a bit of a mystery to me. They seem to be able to replace whole phrases or even entire clauses sometimes. It's kind of mind-boggling.
You're right, they're like little chameleons of the grammar world, changing their meaning depending on the context. But don't worry, when it comes to placement, they generally stick to the same rules as object pronouns.
So they like to be near the verb, just like those possessive pronouns we talked about earlier, always wanting to be in on the action.
You got it. They're like those friends who always want to be in the thick of things. So, for example, j'y vais means I'm going there, and je l'ai déjà fait means I've already done it. See how they fit right into the sentence structure?
Yeah, it's like there are these tiny words packing a ton of meaning. I'm starting to see why they're so important in French, even if they can be a little tricky to get the hang of at first.
They're definitely essential. And speaking of essential, let's talk about a couple of irregular comparative forms that often trip people up. Mieux for better and moins for less. They can be a bit sneaky.
Ooh, those irregular forms. I remember seeing them in the pronunciator library. Do they still follow those typical comparative placement rules we talked about before? Or do they, break all the rules?
Well, they like to keep us on our toes, but for the most part, they do stick to the rules. Mieux and moins generally prefer to be right before the verb they're modifying, just like their more regular counterparts. So he sings better than her would be il chante mieux qu'elle.
Okay. That makes me feel better. So even with the irregular forms, those core placement principles still hold true. It's like having a secret decoder ring for adverbs. I love it.
That's the idea. We want to empower you to see the patterns and make sense of the logic behind it all. And speaking of patterns, let's tackle another big question I keep seeing from pronunciator users. Where do adverbs of quantity like beaucoup or peu go, especially in those tricky compound tenses? That always throws me off.
Oh my gosh, yes. Adverbs of quantity. They can be so confusing, especially when those past participles get involved. It's like, where do they even belong?
Think of it this way. Adverbs of quantity have a special bond with the past participle, almost like they're directly describing it. So in the sentence, j'ai beaucoup mangé, I have eaten a lot, beaucoup goes right after the past participle, manger.
So it's like they're glued to that past participle, emphasizing just how much of something was done.
Yeah.
It's all about clarity, right? Making sure the meaning is crystal clear.
Exactly. French grammar might seem complicated at first, but it's all designed to make communication precise and elegant. And adverb placement is a big part of that.
I'm telling you, this deep dive has been a game changer. I feel like I can finally see the method behind the so-called madness of French grammar. It's amazing.
I love to hear that. And that's what we're all about, helping you move beyond just memorizing rules, but to truly understand the why behind them. And now, speaking of why, let's venture into the world of conditional sentences. You know those sentences with si, that if idea. Do adverbs act any differently in those situations?
Ooh, conditional sentences. They're always so interesting because they explore possibilities. It's like what could happen or what might have happened. Do adverbs get more adventurous in those hypothetical scenarios?
Actually, not so much. Adverb placement in C clauses pretty much follows the same principles we've been discussing all along. The main thing is to make sure the adverb is clearly linked to the verb it's describing, whether it's in the C clause or the main clause. It's all about clarity and making sure the meaning is super clear.
So context is key, as always. Now let's talk about those inquisitive adverbs, those question words like quand, pourquoi, and comment. They're always leading the charge in questions, like they're the detectives of the sentence, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. They're like the conductors of the orchestra, setting the tone for the whole question. They usually go at the beginning, followed by that inverted subject-verb order that's so common in French questions. It's like they're setting the stage for the answer we're looking for.
So, like in the sentence, quand êtes-vous arrivé? Which means, when did you arrive? That quand is right at the front, letting us know we're asking about time.
Perfect example. And then we have that classic French question structure with the verb coming before the subject. It's all about that beautiful French flow. Now, how about we shift gears a bit and talk about those disjunctive adverbs like heureusement, fortunately, or malheureusement, unfortunately. They always add a bit of drama or opinion to a sentence, don't they?
Oh, I love those. They're like the spice of a sentence, adding a little extra flavor and personality. But where do they sit in with all these adverb placement rules? It seems like they could go almost anywhere.
You're right. They do have a bit more freedom. They can hang out at the beginning, at the end, or even slip into the middle of a sentence. but they usually have a comma setting them apart, which adds to their dramatic flair.
So it's like they're making a grand entrance, pausing for effect before they deliver their line. Now, what about those times when we have two adverbs in the same sentence? Is there a certain order they need to follow, or is it a free-for-all?
Well, when two adverbs decide to share the stage, the order usually depends on their type and their relationship with the verb. But a good general rule is that adverbs of manner usually go before adverbs of time. For example, you might say, Il a chanté magnifiquement hier soir. He sang magnificently last night.
Ah, so it's like a little adverbial dance, each one finding its perfect spot to create a harmonious sentence. This is making me realize how much artistry goes into crafting a well-structured French sentence.
You're getting it. French grammar is like a beautiful dance, with each element working together to create an elegant and meaningful whole.
Speaking of beautiful things, let's wrap up our adverb extravaganza with those relative adverbial pronouns like où, meaning where. Those always pop up in those more complex sentences in the pronunciator library and sometimes make my head spin a little.
Relative adverbial pronouns can be a bit tricky, but think of them as bridges, connecting a relative clause to the main clause. They give us extra information about a noun or pronoun, and they usually hang out at the beginning of the relative clause. For example, you might say, La ville où j'habite est magnifique. The city where I live is magnificent.
So où is like a tour guide, leading us to a deeper understanding of the city. Wow, what an incredible journey through the world of French adverbs. I honestly feel like I've unlocked a whole new level of understanding, and I'm so much more confident about using them correctly now.
And that's what we were hoping for. We wanted you to walk away from this deep dive feeling empowered, not just with a bunch of memorized rules, but with a real grasp of the logic and the beauty of French grammar. And now, armed with this knowledge, I'm confident you'll be able to conquer that pronunciator adverb certificate with flying colors.
I'm ready. Bring on those quizzes. I feel like I have a secret weapon now, a deep understanding of how these adverbs work their magic in French.
That's the attitude. And remember, even native speakers make mistakes sometimes. The key is to keep practicing, keep exploring, and above all, keep having fun with the language.
You bet. This whole deep dive has been a game changer for me. I'm feeling so inspired to keep pushing myself and discover even more about the intricacies and the beauty of French. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and guiding us through this adventure. I can't wait to see what other linguistic mysteries we can unravel together in the future.